Thank you. Let me begin by thanking James and Phil for inviting me to be a part of this really amazing and unique learning community. Just to give you some idea of how unique this community is, Matthew, a few minutes ago, posed a question in which he mentioned the French philosopher Catherine Malabou, not knowing that Malabou's English translator is here among us, Carolyn Shred. So that's the kind of great synergies that can happen in a group like this. And congratulations to the Nida School for bringing this group of people together. This is my first, I'm going to begin my lecture, my first of 3 lectures, in the way that Don Corrali begins every one of his translation workshops by saying, I have nothing to teach you. And that is especially true this year because there are very few doctoral students, very many people, most of you are already teaching translation. So I'll try to pose a number of questions that we can discuss through the course of the week. I should also say a lot of my examples are based on the United States, which is a little anomalous. It's a very late comer to translation studies, and still we're very behind in some interesting ways. So one common theme that'll run through my 3 talks is the relationship between the discipline of translation studies, which I'll refer to with capital T and S, and the interest in translation and translation studies that's emerging across the humanities and social sciences, often referred to as the translational turn, which I'll refer to with a small TS, translation studies. Turn it on. Yeah. All right, so what is the relationship between translation studies and translation studies? Does translation studies, small ts, challenge our established models and paradigms which were designed to train professional translators? Does TS call for new pedagogical approaches and materials? If so, what would they look like? But in a larger sense, this is about maybe a struggle between what the Russian literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin called centripetal forces of consolidation, standardization, unification, and centrifugal forces of dispersion, right? Do those necessarily have to be in conflict? To cite Michael, do we have to think of it as a zero-sum game, or can we think of a blue model? Maybe, of course, as Dan would suggest, the answer is jujitsu, I don't know. And can translation studies and translation studies coexist in a productive, mutually interrogating relationship? Now, I say that because there has been some critique of translation studies' ambition to be an independent discipline. This was a quote from Brian Lennon's quite interesting book, In Babel's Shadow. He's a comparative literature scholar at Pennsylvania State University and claims that translation studies, capital TS, has erased precisely the theoretical advantage of its practice, its deixis with respect to theories of literary theory itself as something other than, or in addition to, or more than descriptive science. This doubling down on discipline is a mode of bureaucratic leverage with benefits and costs that are plain. While recognizing that critique, I also want to say that I do feel there are distinct benefits of having a discipline with its own publishing venues, for example, which can support individual scholars in other fields who are taking the translational turn, but maybe without the support of their discipline at large. So for example, in one of the NEH summer institutes I ran, there was a sociologist, and she told me about a very interesting study she'd done of 50 Latin American, or ethnographies of Latin America written by English or Anglophone scholars. Fewer than 25% even mentioned the fact that language mediation was involved in this research. This is even more surprising given the fact that post-structuralist anthropology focuses on the, or is premised on the notion of the researcher's positionality, right? Why not linguistic reflexivity, right? So very surprising. In any case, she also told me that she had submitted the manuscript to a sociology journal and it was rejected. I suggested she might submit it to Translation and Interpreting Studies. I thought she'd find a more welcoming audience. It was accepted, And now, of course, it's out there in a peer-reviewed journal and can be cited as we continue to debate these issues, right? And I would also mention a new series coming out of Routledge, Translation Studies in Translation, which is going to focus on translation writings or translation-related writings, especially in the global South, which have been largely left out of the field of translation studies, which still suffers from a distinctly Eurocentric bias, right? So in that sense, translation studies, capital TS, can model the integration of translation and translated text for other fields seeking to transnationalize their approaches and optics. So some of the benefits. A little background from where I come from in terms of pedagogy. I've been teaching over 20 years in a translator education program that offers a BS, an MA, and a PhD in translation. As I like to say, cradle to grave translation studies. We're one of the only programs, I think, in the States that gives a PhD in translation studies. The other programs, it comes out of comparative literature with a concentration. I also have served for 12 years as the director of a summer language immersion program in critical languages for high school students. And during 5 of those 12 years, we offered a 10-day teacher immersion program for high school teachers of these languages. And that was a fascinating experience for me, the teacher training. Because on the one hand, you see many commonalities in teaching applied disciplines or proficiencies such as language, translation, or teaching, right? And I came to be acutely aware of the fact that the relationship between knowing and doing is not direct and is profoundly unpredictable or stochastic. So for example, these teachers who had gone through many professional development seminars, by year 2 and 3 could really talk the talk. They knew all the terminology and they seemed very comfortable with it, and they still couldn't design a learner-centered task-based lesson or deliver it effectively. So how then, what is the challenge of that? It's that we can't just keep throwing more declarative knowledge at them and hoping that finally there will be enough and they will be able to embody that knowledge. It doesn't work that way, right? So it challenges the way we think about delivering information, especially when we want to produce some kind of proficiency. Now, back in 2003, one of my earliest publications was the collected volume Beyond the Ivory Tower, Rethinking Translation Pedagogy. And the issues we were confronting then were quite different from the issues we're confronting today. Back then it was there such a thing as translation pedagogy? Did we need it? A lot of programs, especially in the States, thought, oh, we just need to plunk a translator professional in the classroom and all our problems are solved. Right? So we were making an argument there that there was such a thing as translation pedagogy, and I encouraged people in the introduction to look to second language acquisition as a source of transferable pedagogical approaches and strategies, such as scaffolding, input strategies, etc. And this was related to a rethinking of translation training at that period. So when we started calling it translation education, right? We weren't teaching people just how to press some buttons, and this was especially true as technology was being incorporated into the classroom. How can we teach principles, ethics, etc., especially given the fact that the translation technology was changing so fast. So if you're only teaching them how to press some buttons, that knowledge won't last. It will grow old pretty quickly. All right, so that's what the background I'm coming with to this talk on emerging contexts of translation pedagogy. Now, I've been observing in the States a very interesting phenomenon, this sudden intense interest in translation pedagogy. So the American Literary Translators Association in 2017 featured a stream of panels dedicated to translation pedagogy in rooms that were larger than this one. They were packed. I mean, there was an energy, there was a hunger for this. Just recently, I attended a conference, Translation and Global Literacies. They had expected 50 participants. They had to increase the admission to 60 because of the demand. And there's already a second conference planned for spring of 2019. And Carolyn told me about a conference on translation pedagogy to be held in June at Montclair State University in New Jersey. So what is behind this sudden intense interest? It does not reflect the birth of a bunch of new translator training programs in the United States. In fact, it reflects new and emerging contexts of translation pedagogy, which I'd like to discuss today, because they pose a series of practical, theoretical, and ethical questions, but also some benefits for TS, capital TS. So what I'll do is try to map these emerging contexts. Where are they appearing? Why have they emerged, and specifically at this time, and what are the challenges and benefits presented by these emerging contexts? And finally, how can we in translation studies support these new contexts of translation pedagogy in order to ensure that this translational turn is not a blip or a fad, that we in fact have a lot invested in translation consciousness, translation literacy being spread across the social sciences and humanities. It's not for translator training alone. So mapping the emerging context, I'm going to talk about some new contexts that are emerging within professional certificate and degree granting programs, translation courses and programs developing in foreign language departments, and programs and courses in comparative literature and world literature departments. Now, there are a number of factors which I'll discuss behind these emerging contexts. I think clearly economic ones, but also socio-political ones, this idea that access to translation and interpreting services is a human right, but also theoretical, conceptual, pedagogical ones. A lot of people are rethinking what the objectives are of their teaching and of their field in general. And this has made openings for translation to come in. All right? So the first emerging context deals with professional certificate and degree granting programs. And here we see the emergence of new modalities, in particular online blended learning possibilities. One of the reasons we're seeing an expansion in these offerings is because we know there are jobs. In fact, it's one of the fastest growing sectors of the US economy, what we call the language industry. It's on a par with nursing. And so this is an argument that you can make to administrators, and it's rather convincing. But of course, there are also socio-political reasons behind this. Again, the increasing recognition that access to high-quality translation and interpreting services is a human right, which unfortunately is a notion that is currently embattled. Some of you may know one of the first things the Trump administration did was to remove all the Spanish translations from the White House website. So these nationalist movements have been reflected in an attack on translation and interpreting services. So there's an increasing sense that translation and interpreting services in courts and hospitals need to be better regulated, and some states are now require certification, and others are expected to follow. And so the universities will then be expected to provide that certification. But of course, under the economic constraints of the neoliberal university, administrators agree to this because they're hoping it will increase enrollments, and so new courses are often online. Many times they are asynchronous, which might make it difficult to create strong learning communities and cohorts. I mean, I think all of us here understand face-to-face has a power maybe that online doesn't. But we still need some more research on that. But also new programs, and this is what's most interesting to me, may not be language pair specific. And this is specifically the case at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where they have a program in which you can come in with any language pair as long as you translate into English, right? So first we can, based on our traditional model, this might seem a little horrifying, and how do we guarantee quality and assessment, etc. But what's also interesting about it is that it allows us to go beyond the very limited course offerings we have in our traditional programs, right? So basically, we can only offer the major languages, and we continually to offer them. And so minor languages are increasingly left out. So this is, I've been watching this and seeing it evolve at the University of Illinois, and one of the teachers told me that last class she had people with French, German, of course, but also with Korean, with Japanese, and one person with Luxembourgish as his source language. So, of course, this would not be possible in a traditional training program. So, again, costs and benefits. In the end, we need more research on this, but the teacher was explaining to me that one of her, the most important foci is to develop skills of self-revision, autonomous learning, etc. And again, it addresses the fact that although there are 7,000 something languages currently spoken across the world, 23 dominate and spoken by over 1/2 of the world's population. And this is from the Salzburg report on a multilingual world, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But again, if we can create programs that allow for translation from minor programs, this is an unexpected benefit. A more interesting context, perhaps, is the foreign language classroom. Interesting and surprising, because those of us who were trained in foreign language pedagogy in the 80s and 90s in the communicative approach knew that translation and L1 were banished from the foreign language classroom, right? But there now is an opening, and we're starting to see a reconsideration of translation for a number of reasons. First, sagging enrollments, which is paradoxical, right? So in the 90s and 2000s, we saw the paradoxical phenomenon of increasing globalization accompanied by a sharp decrease in the study of foreign languages among high schools and college students, right? Why should that be? Is it perhaps the people thought, oh, everyone will speak English, or now we have all these machine translation tools available and we don't need this? It's unclear. Or because departments think foreign language instruction is expensive. You can't teach a foreign language in a lecture hall of 150, right? So there are a lot of economic pressures encouraging people to introduce translation also as a way to tie students to possible career trajectories, right? And again, at the same time as we saw this fall in enrollments, we see this exponential growth in the language industry, right? So this is what Michael was saying before, how there's all the statistics about people in the humanities being hired in all these sectors, more above STEM, people with STEM degrees, and yet there are these deep prejudices among administrators to these arguments. But in any case, incorporating translation into the foreign language curriculum was part of an effort to boost enrollments by providing non-literary options, right? Because not only was foreign language instruction, did it banish L1, it was heavily literary focused, and that didn't appeal to all students, and also providing applied skills. But there was a deeper theoretical reason behind this. You may know the 2007 report of the Modern Language Association encouraged us to rethink the very objectives of foreign language teaching. They said we shouldn't think of the native speaker, or what the top was, the educated native speaker, as the goal of our foreign language instruction. Very few people who start as young adults will ever reach that, right? So let's think about something, and so most people then will fail, right? And that's the reaction of many people in American schools, that they feel they failed at foreign languages. But instead, this idea of translingual and transcultural competence, which places value on the ability to operate between languages, right? Very close to translators and people with intercultural competence. This was revolutionary, right? It finally gave entree for translation to start to come back into the foreign language classroom. So the report encouraged foreign language departments to reorient themselves away from what they called the unrealistic goal of replicating the competence of an educated native speaker, a goal that post-adolescent learners rarely reach, toward the idea of translingual and transcultural competence. All right, and there were also broader theoretical and pedagogical reasons behind this. It reflected a broader rethinking in educational research of the very opposition between knowledge and proficiency, right? They started to break down this idea that there was something different between skills and this declarative knowledge. Or, yes, again, declarative knowledge versus skills, as evidenced today in the promotion of service and experiential learning, right? That the best learning actually is through the doing. They're not two separate things. And also, as I said before about teacher training, you can't just keep dumping on more and more knowledge in order to produce proficiency, right? And I say this is a new trend in education, but of course it's old wisdom. Benjamin Franklin said, "Tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I learn." And we see here too the increase in volunteer opportunities. Translation is great for this, right? A lot of my students contact NGOs to see if they have anything they would like translated, and maybe they'll post to their websites. So it's a way to feel involved and that they're making a difference. And again, it's part of a broad effort also to transnationalize the study of foreign languages. I think Great Britain is taking the lead in this. There's a multi-university project called Transnationalizing Modern Languages. Very interesting. I was able to attend one of the meetings at the University of Cardiff in 2017. And although they hadn't fully integrated translation, theoretically they were ready, right? Because they were trying to move beyond the nationalist paradigm that had led to the exclusion of translations from the foreign language classroom. So I think we're going to see here increasing openness to translation. But of course, there are still a lot of challenges. There's enormous resistance to the incorporation of translation into SLA on the part of many faculty members trained in literary studies. I find these stories again and again in the States, especially in Spanish departments, that a dean thinks, oh, we'll have the great idea of starting a translation program or offering translation courses, and then the faculty is adamantly against it. And I just had a student who had a job in such a department, and she ended up leaving because she felt it wasn't, they weren't in fact going to continue and support a translation studies program. And of course, translation in the foreign language classroom continues to be associated in the minds of many with grammar translation, right? That is using translation as a comprehension check. So in order for it to be effectively incorporated, we have to rethink translation away from that model, which of course came from the teaching of ancient, quote unquote, dead languages, etc. All right, so conceptually, there was just no place for translation. And this is evident if you know about best practices in foreign language teaching, the emphasis they place on what they call authentic materials. And those are materials created by native speakers for native speakers. And typically that did not include translations, right? Although, why not, right? Translations are created by native speakers for native speakers. So I've made over the years to the government site visitors, I've made the argument that it's certainly legitimate to introduce translations, not made by the teacher, right, in order to create a text that meets the student's proficiency level, but actual, what Turi called facts of the target culture. So my elementary Russian group, they sing a lot of songs, and among them is the Russian translation of Where's All the Flowers Gone? It's popular in Russian, Russians know it. It's good for teaching plurals, among other things. But again, these are facts of the target culture. And so these are arguments we have to be making for why it's legitimate to include that and why this notion of authentic materials, of course, authenticity is something that translation, I think, is especially good at challenging and deconstructing. Right? All right. And this is something by Anthony Pym. So it's not just that foreign language instructors were resistant to translation. He suggests that people in translation, with their focus on professional competence, were also very resistant to playing nice with the foreign language instructors. So as he says, recent interest in the role of translation in language teaching calls for dialogue between the disciplines of translation studies and language education. In framing this dialogue, translation scholars would do well to avoid assuming superiority or special knowledge. They would instead do well to reflect on the history of their own discipline, particularly the opposition to language departments that can be found in some countries in the 1980s and 90s. I can speak from my own experience that the opposition came from both directions. But then he goes on, in politically turning away from language learning, translation scholars left the education field open for unopposed implantation of immersion and communicative teaching methods that ideologically shunned translation. Further, in framing their major internal debates in terms of binary categories, usually involving a good translation method opposed to a bad one, translation scholars themselves all but abandon the non-binary pedagogical models that once included many types of translation solutions. I'm happy to say I think this is no longer true. Those non-binary models should now be invested anew in order to rebrand translation for the language education community. And that has been happening, and I'll have a few examples of the more promising results in that respect. I don't know why it does that. Just click right here. Yep. All right, some of the potential benefits, of course, as I mentioned, it allows us to move beyond these nationalist paradigms that have organized the study of language and literatures since the institutionalization of modern language studies in the 19th century, right? They were meant to demonstrate the genius of the national language and the national culture. Can we imagine language studies outside of their paradigm? It allows us to reconceive authenticity, as in this concept of authentic materials, and to include. So one way is to just bust the idea of authenticity entirely. Another way is to expand it by including things like translation and other phenomena that have long been excluded as inauthentic. Right, why shouldn't a popular translation done by a target language speaker for target language audience be considered authentic? My third context, comparative literature and world literature programs, which have really gotten into the translation game, perhaps most spectacularly with Emily Apter's book Against World Literature, in which she puts forward this idea of untranslatability, which was not well received among translation studies people. In fact, Lawrence Venuti wrote a scathing review in which at the end he said Verso publishers should be ashamed for having published such a book. So it was met with very violent reactions. So I want to talk a little bit about why that would be. Again, the economic underpinnings to the rise of world literature are clear, right? You could teach huge lecture classes because no one needed to know a foreign language. They were all taught in English, right? And so they promised large enrollments. The teacher also didn't need to know a foreign language, so it made it economically very feasible. But there were also a number of socio-political reasons, right? In recognition of the increasing diversity of the US population, universities have been globalizing their curricula, resulting in the fact that more and more teachers find themselves teaching texts in translation, and increasingly texts from languages and cultures with which they may have little or no familiarity. Like now they're teaching Gilgamesh and they have no cultural connection to that. And we also see a real learning process in world literature studies, especially in the work of David Damrosch, who began not really incorporating translation, but we see a steady increase in his understanding of the role translation plays in the creation of world literature. And it's come to the point now that he describes or defines world literature as texts that get translated, right? So now it's the essential component, the defining feature of those things. And in his latest books, he's included chapters on translation. In his Harvard Summer School on World Literature, he now regularly invites Raina Meilertz from KU Leuven, who's a translation specialist, etc. So there's been a learning process there. So there's an increasing awareness that there's an ethical dimension to considering the role of translation in the circulation of ideas and texts, right? These are not transparently supported, or the text that we read, the same, quote unquote, same text we read in one culture will not be received in the same way. Damrosch has a wonderful article about death in translation, where he talks about a Serbian novel which was proclaimed a postmodern classic in the West, but had real nationalist thematics among Serbian readers. Or I did a study of Oscar Wilde in Russia, and specifically in post-Soviet Russia, where his key works were considered to be his prison narratives, De Profundis and On Reading Jail, right? Whereas in the West, those are considered marginal works produced under duress. Many English scholars in the West treat them with ambivalence, but for the Russians, they were key. And of course, by claiming them to be key to his oeuvre, they also implicitly redeem his imprisonment. And in fact, you'll find in Russia many connections between Wilde and Dostoevsky, as astounding as this may seem. And of course, the narrative was that Dostoevsky's imprisonment allowed him to create his great post-exile novels, right? And so they say that in other words, you have to have De Profundis and On Reading Jail be his greatest novels in order to redeem his imprisonment. So again, these same works are being read in radically different ways. Right? And this is also part of a larger effort to transnationalize the study of literature and culture, again, by moving beyond national paradigms. And this is, too, is linked to a profound rethinking of authenticity that had regulated not just translation, but all those assorted phenomena, such as pseudo-translation. I mean, when we think of the fact that Ossian's Songs of Ossian by Macpherson were one of the most popular works of their time, one of the most translated works of their time, and typically aren't read in English curriculum because they're fakes, right? Amazing. And especially the relay or indirect translations, which have been doubly marginalized, right? Marginalized as doubly inauthentic, although they played and continue to play a hugely important role in the development of cultures. I would mention here Hee-Kyung Cho's excellent book, Translations, Forgotten History, where she talks about the role of translations of Russian literature in the formation of early modern Korean literature. And these translations of Russian literature were often from the Japanese, and the Japanese translations were often from English or French translations of the Russian. So these were thrice mediated works, but that didn't stop them from having an enormous impact on Korean literature at the time. So again, this idea of authenticity, really we need to push back on it, and translation, I think, is one avenue to really deconstruct that whole idea. Now, some of the challenges they're facing is that while Damrosch notes in his book, Teaching World Literature, the desire of instructors to address the problematics of translation, only one chapter in the 400-page collected volume is dedicated to that. It's a chapter written by Venuti in which he assumes a common source language for the readers, which in a world literature classroom is almost never the case, right? And of course, it's Spanish, which is the most commonly studied language, foreign language in the US. But again, this is almost never the case. And again, similar to foreign language studies, as universities globalize their curriculum, more and more teachers are finding them teaching texts in translation that they don't understand. Moreover, world literature courses, and this is one of my pet peeves, are typically in the United States taught in English departments, right? Where the instructor probably doesn't know any language or foreign language, let alone have any experience translating, right? So that makes it all the more difficult or unlikely that they will incorporate some discussion of these works as translation, where they will recognize their unique ontological status as translations. So without that basic translation literacy, these instructors are likely, in the absence of any pedagogical support, either to ignore the fact that these texts are translations or to treat them as a necessary evil, right? I'm sorry, but we have to read these in translation because we don't know Russian, etc. Now, new courses often, as I've noticed attending various conferences on this topic, the new courses being developed in these contexts often do not have clear objectives. Are they teaching students about translation, right, as a cultural, philosophical phenomenon, or are they teaching students how to do translation? And I think that's very different, and I'll talk about this on Wednesday more. The theory, the thinking needed to support the doing of translation is quite different than the texts you might read to think about the role of translation in studies. But often these courses will have them do both, right? And I think this lack of clear objectives is often reflected in the reading selected. I mean, I will say something that might sound blasphemous, but I do not have students read The Task of the Translator by Benjamin in a novice translation practice course. I think that threatens to do more harm than good, right? But the potential benefits, of course, it gives increased awareness of the role of translation and an increased appreciation, increased visibility for the work of translators in the circulation of text and ideas. So certainly those of us in translation studies, capital TS, have a lot to gain from the spread of translation literacy across fields, right? So some promising signs within these emerging contexts. One of the early signs of collaboration between translation studies scholars and foreign language instructors is this hot off the press article by Sonia Colina and Barbara Laffer, Translation in Spanish Language Teaching, the Integration of a Fifth Skill in the Second Language Curriculum. So not only do they make the argument for incorporating translation, they provide concrete exercises that you might use. Translation interpreting activities are now being integrated into real-world scenarios in textbooks, beginning from the earliest levels of instruction. And again, this is not grammar translation. This is translation thought of in a different, more holistic way by moving beyond the and moreover, what's interesting to me is that they're appearing in first-year textbooks of foreign language. Right? This represents a very different paradigm. Before we had this developmental kind of paradigm, you got translation competence after you obtained language proficiency, right? And now they're introducing it at the same time. And I think that's very interesting, right? Let me give a couple examples of what those scenarios might look like for those of you who think, how could you have a translation scenario in a novice level textbook? This is a Russian textbook, Golasa, and it has things like this. You have been asked to interpret for a Russian exchange student who is seeking accommodations at your university. He needs to talk to the housing director. Your task is to communicate ideas, not translate word for word, etc. They're crude, but we're seeing them emerge, and they're explicitly telling them, you know, don't try to do this word for word. Another Russian textbook, Beginner's Russian, offers translation assignments phrased in terms of translating ideas, not words, in contexts that appeal to students' interests. So help an American chain opening a restaurant in Russia translate their advertising brochure, right? And that's nice because you can talk then about global issues related to localization of images, etc. And students really like that kind of assignment. And again, we're dealing often with young adult learners, and so this invoking their schemata is actually very effective, right? And also we see it being introduced from the very beginning of language instruction in order to tie students to career paths as early as possible. We've done at least in the United States, we've done a horrible job telling foreign language students that there are jobs out there for people with advanced level or professional proficiency, right? So it provides them with early extrinsic motivation that studies show may help them get over the hard times in their language study and persevere, right? While also suggesting that translation pedagogy is not just for training translators, right? So we're not introducing this to you in the novice course because we think you're all going to be professional translators. You won't be. So we're starting to see people make the argument for translation literacy, for partial understanding, that again, you don't need professional competence. And here we see an example from that Salzburg report I mentioned before, where they write, in today's interconnected world, the ability to speak multiple languages and communicate across linguistic divides is a critical skill. Even partial knowledge of more than one language is beneficial. Proficiency in additional languages is a new kind of global literacy. Language learning needs to be expanded for all, young and old. And again, the argument at the end, young and old, just because you're old doesn't mean you can't learn another language or should. Yes, you might not become a language professional, but again, making the argument that exposure to this is hugely important in our globalized, interconnected, multilingual world, right? And so we can make the same argument. I mean, I have a colleague, French-speaking colleague who says, oh, why did we even have a foreign language requirement? After 2 years, they can't do anything with the language. So I do think it's important to make arguments like this, that not everyone will be a professional, but awareness of how language works, how translation works, is hugely important. Right? And this is from the same article I quoted above by him, where he writes that translation scholars may need to break the unspoken pact that they have developed with translation professions. They should instead adopt a view where everyone can translate, not just professionals, and everyone can be trained to translate better. So yes, it's often going to be the case that someone on a study abroad, or you're hosting a foreign student at your school, etc., you can serve as an ad hoc interpreter. But I think we have to make a much larger argument than non-professional translation. And actually this argument was made by Andrei Fyodorov, the Soviet translation theorist, back in 1953. He wrote, "The important place of translation as an object of study in the field of philology and higher education and in the teaching of foreign languages in non-language related institutions of higher learning and in secondary schools, all this makes it only natural that there would be an interest in issues of translation not only among translators themselves, but among philologists and writers, as well as in much broader circles of readers." Right? And as Piotr Blumczynski argues, translation is ubiquitous. I believe the same, especially in our world. We see it all over, sometimes overt, sometimes covert. But to the extent that translation is everywhere, then translation literacy is relevant to everyone, not just to professional translators and their teachers. And in fact, we have some documentation of the low level of translation literacy, even among people who deal with translations on a regular basis. So, for example, Bernardini did a study of clients and employers of translators, and when they were asked whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement that translation is easy when you know two languages, 51% of the interviewees agreed or strongly agreed, while only 27% disagreed or strongly disagreed. Right? So again, the idea of client education remains incredibly important. But also we see this in translation criticism in the newspapers. I did a study of New York Times reviews of translated works. I was just curious, I'm fascinated by how non-translators or people involved in translation, where they get their ideas about what translation is. And I conjectured that the newspaper would be one site where you'd see some translation criticism. And it was a little depressing. I looked at 1900, 1950, and 2000. And in fact, the 1900 was perhaps the most positive criticism. They were very polite, and the reigning metaphor there was task. The translation was hard work. And often they complimented the translator on doing a fine job at translating a very difficult author. 1950 corpus was very influenced by the kind of internationalism, euphoric internationalism of the post-war period. In fact, in one review by W.H. Auden, he writes, "Every translator is an international ambassador of goodwill." And then in the 2000 corpus, it was surprisingly pessimistic. Right? The translation is not perfect, but what translation could be, things like this. And so, this idea of untranslatability did not come out of nowhere. I mean, I think there was a larger kind of cultural malaise about the possibility of international or intercultural communication, etc. In any case, we see in these high-profile controversies, and the one about the recent English translation of the Korean novel The Vegetarian, this received a whole lot of attention in the States, and to see how people talked about translation was fascinating. And I think it highlighted the really low level of translation literacy among the general public, but also among the reviewers of these things, so highly educated people. Emily Wilson, who herself is a translator, she did a really well-received retranslation of the Odyssey, and she writes, "The literary storm revealed how fraught the entire topic of translation can be and how little agreement there is about what exactly counts as good translation." But later in that same article, she writes, many people complain that the translator did not follow the Korean syntax, and she did not. Well, if anybody knows about Korean and Chinese into English, you're not going to follow the syntax, or you're going to present something bizarre and unreadable, right? So really the possibility of replicating the syntax for almost any language is impossible. So again, just these assumptions about what a language is. Now the Salzburg report ends by also seeking a recognition or underscoring the need for a recognition of the vital importance of translation and interpreting to ensure equitable participation in multilingual societies. But I think such recognition will not happen until there is a better understanding of the translator's task among non-translators, right? It can't be empty, oh yes, thank you to the translators out there, but they have to understand what the work of translation is, right? And so all of this underscores the need for basic translation, or for translation studies, capital TS, to take the lead in promoting translation literacy as a necessary component of global literacy across the academy as well as outside the academy, right? It must be a component, or it must be taught alongside what we call global literacy now, but also what we call information literacy, right? With the rise of the internet, many people have been calling for information literacy to be taught in schools so people can evaluate what it is they're finding on the internet, what's its reliability, etc. And similarly, translations, how would we even begin to assess their quality or to understand how they're produced? So I don't know, how am I doing for time?
You're fine. 10 minutes.
All right. So I just wanted to give a module that I use to introduce translation literacy. What am I talking about? And I think this is as relevant in your novice translation practice class as is in any other context that I've been discussing today. Because what we know, for those of you who've taught translation, especially the novices, precisely what Emily Wilson mentioned is in their minds. I can't change the syntax. How can I didn't know until the workshop that I was allowed to do that, right? How do we authorize them to think differently about translation, right? And so we know that they have this very simple model of translation in their heads as a simple linguistic matching game, one that is only reinforced by the current ubiquity of machine translation tools, where to them it appears, oh, I press a button, I get the right answer. That's what translation is, because these tools obscure the work of translation. They are mining enormous databases of human translated texts, right? And most people don't know that when they're using these, right? And of course, related to that understanding of translation is this idea, oh, if I can only get a big enough bilingual dictionary, all my problems will be solved. Right? So this conceptualization of translation, we can deduce from it a number of assumptions about the nature of language itself, right? That languages are basically equivalent codes, that all languages describe the same reality, that meaning exists a priori in a sentence or utterance that is subjected to translation. So we recover this meaning. And the research has shown us that this is then reflected, this conceptualization is reflected in student behaviors. Right? This is what we call bottom-up processing. They translate small units, words, phrases to the detriment of textual cohesion. I mean, if Fanuti wants to see a foreignized translation, have him come into my novice translation class. I mean, the failure to check meanings against the context, inability or reluctance to move away from source text syntax. That is huge. I think it was maybe in Mona Baker's and other words where she said, you know, students cling to the source syntax like drowning people to a rock. You know, how do I move away from this? Overuse and misuse of dictionaries to the detriment of other resources such as parallel text, background reading, targeted research, etc. Or it's a real aha moment when they look at the dictionary meanings, they can't find one that suits, and then they maybe go from there to a thesaurus or go from there, you know, beyond that to understand that words, well, what the limits of dictionaries are. All right? So understanding the nature of translation requires an understanding of the nature of natural languages, right? 4 key concepts I introduced, and again, I'll do this very briefly, but this is what I think constitutes the core of translation literacy. 1, languages, natural languages. We can create codes that are symmetrical and equivalent, but natural languages never are, even those that are fairly close in a language family. That means you're never going to match up simply or easily. I ask my students to contemplate for just a moment, what does it mean if a word-for-word translation is not a sense-for-sense translation, right? How could this be? Why should there be a distinction? It's because they're asymmetrical, right? Of course, one of the readings they really like is Borges' Pierre Menard, which presents this quest It's an impossible quest for sameness in language to be an impossible or quixotic one, because languages are asymmetrical. That's also why in our undergraduate course we use Mona Baker's In Other Words, because she basically maps the asymmetries in languages, right? And so helps them reconceptualize the translator's task from one of finding equivalents or matches to one of managing asymmetries, right? Which can be very complicated. Moreover, the number and nature of decision-making changes the more distant the two languages are. Russian languages are synthetic, English analytical, and so at the beginning of class I write a simple 5-word sentence on the board, "Девушка положила очки на стол," because of course people are said, oh yes, well in poetry, of course, but a simple declarative sentence. Russian doesn't have articles, just like Chinese and Japanese don't have articles. So in a simple sentence, we're probably making 7 or 8 decisions, right, about how to render those. And as Jerzy Levy says, the decisions you make at one point in your text will influence all subsequent decisions, right? So for me, this is key. How can I get them to understand translation as a decision-making process? And then what will guide their decision-making? What can I give them to guide their decision-making? A nice reading to underscore this is Nabokov's beautiful postscript to his Russian translation of Lolita. You may remember this was his first novel in English, which made him internationally famous. He was asked to translate it into Russian. He did so reluctantly. He said, what Russian is going to read this book that won't be sold in the Soviet Union? But in any case, it's a very beautiful meditation on the differences between English and Russian. And this is a nice passage from Iris Murdoch's Word Child, where he said, Sunday had passed somehow. I went to the cinema twice and got drunk in the intervals. I also walked a good deal. There are so many kinds of walking. I walked a sad kind of metaphysical sad London walking, which I had walked before, only I performed it now with an almost ritual intensity. In Russian, there is no general word for go. Going has to be specified as walking or riding, then as perfective or imperfective walking or riding, then as perfective or imperfective habitual or non-habitual walking or riding, all involving different words. The sort of walking which I indulged in on that Sunday deserved a special word to celebrate its conceptual peculiarity. Also, this is a text I use. If you can find a text, often by maybe a daring avant-garde artist who's using the resources of the source language in really interesting ways, and then to see what resources in English are available to do something similar. And this is from Andrei Biely's modernist masterpiece, Petersburg, where he uses the verb tancevat, to dance, with a million different prefixes, which we can't do in English, so we would have to render those with different prepositions, for example. Right, and then of course to further complicate the model of translation is a linguistic matching game. Add to these semantic asymmetries, phonetic, orthographic asymmetries, and then you can spiral up to obviously differences in cultural capital, prestige of the languages, etc. Key concept number 2, get a very simple concept. Almost all words are polysemous, but the range of meanings don't align. So it was interesting, yesterday in the hotel, when I asked for a cappuccino, they teased me by saying, oh, this isn't a convent. We can't give you a cappuccino, right? But he said convento in Italian, but in English, a convent is only for women, right? So, I mean, there's these simple things where even shared cognates, they don't line up, right? So you have to be very cautious of all this. One of the most famous examples of this, well, this is an example I give. The proposal, предложение in Russian can be a proposal, as in a marriage, proposition or a suggestion, a sentence, a clause, etc. One of the most famous examples of failing to control for polysemy, we could say, is when Khrushchev was speaking to a group of NATO ambassadors in 1958 and said, "Мы вас похороним," and it was translated as, "we will bury you." What was interesting about that is the Russian verb pохоронить has a very narrow semantic range. It's related actually to the word for funeral, похорони. It means to bury something in the ground. It does not have the metaphorical meaning of destroy or overwhelm that English does, right? And in fact, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. All right. Yes, but those were the headlines. "We will bury you," Russian boss rants, raving Soviet boss shouts at the West, "We will bury you," and people interpreted it as a threat of nuclear war. At the time. But if you look in any bilingual dictionary, and next to похоронить, you'll find to bury. So, right? And then finally, meaning does not exist somehow outside of language or before it is subjected to interpretation. Texts or utterances are bundles of meaning potential that are actualized in specific acts of interpretation. That's the nice Steiner talks about. I love this quote, though. If people think about fidelity and what that means, right? And often they think it's associated with literal translation, right? So I'm actually okay with preserving some notion of fidelity if we understand it in a radically different way. So look at this UN interpreter statement from 1955. You may remember this is a time when synchronous interpreting was a new thing, and so they featured UN interpreters in an article in the New York Times, and the title of which was UN Interpreter, Linguist plus Diplomat. And so this is what he says. You must be absolutely faithful to what the delegate is trying to say, right? And so that's the crux of the matter. Then he goes on. You keep up with him, but you also try to make things clear where they are muddy. Sometimes you translate exactly what he says and then add a few words to explain what he means. You lose time that way, but you gain it back by cutting out the padding he puts in to give himself time to think, right? So a lot of interpretive decisions there, a lot of decision making, all under the guise of absolute fidelity. All right, and of course there's the famous statement by Matthew Arnold. Probably both sides would agree that the translator's first duty is to be faithful, but the question at issue between them is in what faithfulness consists. All right? All right. And finally, the last context, the decisive role of context in interpreting utterances. I was doing a collected volume which we were calling Translation in Russian Context, and it encouraged me to look up context. How is it defined, etc. And what's interesting, the etymology in English, right, it's a weaving together, right? And so this idea of weaving, it sounded so much more, a better description of what happens in translation than this carrying over, right? So this idea that, in fact, they say the circumstances that form the setting of an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood or assessed, or without which it cannot be fully understood and assessed, and again, from the Latin, to weave together. So translation, despite the etymology of our word translate, is not like carrying a pile of rocks from one place to the other, but rather like removing something, cutting it out of its fabric and sewing it into or attaching it to another, which I think is beautifully captured by Derrida in his notion of the sheaf, which he calls a complex structure of a weaving, an interlacing which permits the different threads and different lines of meaning or a force to go off again in different directions, just as is it always ready to tie itself up with others. And so you see many people refer to the source text removing something from a web of signification into another one, or Pierre Legrand uses the word a semiotic configuration, right? So this is a very complex process. What's interesting too is if the United States context in the Cold War encouraged people to latch on to that metaphoric definition of Baer, if we look at the original context, you see a very different motivation. Khrushchev was actually citing what was by then a cliche in Marxist discourse, that the proletariat were the grave diggers of the bourgeoisie. And in fact, the statement that came right before "we will bury you" is "history is on our side." Right? This is Thiele. We don't have to kill you. You will die out. Your system is tired and die out. And again, this is from the Communist Manifesto. As you see, Rosa Luxemburg, it was a cliche. So Khrushchev was astonished that it was created such a stir at the time. So again, we have two very different contexts that inevitably shaped the meaning potential of those statements. All right? And so finally, translation of natural languages can never be a simple linguistic matching game. It is always a complex decision-making process. And on Wednesday, I'll start to talk about how we support students then in the next steps of understanding that decision-making process. What can guide them, etc. All right? So that's what I think of as maybe the basics of translation literacy.